Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode.
Hello, Steph.
Hello, Sarah.
I think this is quite exciting. This is the first time we're doing a part 2 from one of our episodes.
Yeah, the demand.
We got a lot of feedback after last week's episode. So there are a few questions and topics that we're going to address today.
Last week being the episode on restriction. How do I know I'm restricting?
Yes. So this will probably just be how do I know I'm restricting part 2.
Part 2.
Because we're super imaginative like that. Plus it makes sense to make it obvious that it's a carry-on. Yeah. So we might as well dive straight in because there was one question that came up in various forms several times, Steph. Mm-hmm. And this one's on you.
Why?
Because you mentioned this subject without expanding, and then everyone was like, what's that? There was a previous episode where I think you did touch on it, but in last week's episode, you mentioned that there was a difference between physical, mental, and emotional restriction around food. And people want to know, what are you talking about, Steph?
You're right. I remember now. I did allude to emotional restriction, which I believe is a third component of restriction, but I believe it to be in a different category than physical and mental restriction. So in the last episode, I expanded on what physical and mental restriction were, never got back to emotional restriction. So emotional restriction is where we are using food in place of emotions or to express emotions or to numb emotions or otherwise using food in that space. So this can show up as excitement even, or being happy. And I used to come home from otherwise exciting events or good news would come my way and I would binge, which really confused me. I didn't understand why I would binge when I was happy. Or on the flip side of that, something bad would happen, or I would feel really disappointed, or even I would just have a bad day at work or something like that. And I would also come home and binge, where I was using food to distract myself from the range of that emotion, or it was simply too much for me. I didn't have capacity to hold the emotion. So I would sort of push it down a bit by using food. So there's all sorts of ways that we can use food in place of emotions, which it overlaps a little with emotional eating. But I think that with emotional eating, like that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think when we're talking about emotional restriction that causes binge eating, this is more of that chronic use of food.
So is the term restriction in here about restricting your feelings?
Yes, not the food. Yes.
So
where I'm calling it emotional restriction, you're restricting the emotions. They're too dangerous, or we don't know what to do with them. They're too big. I grew up not really knowing what to do with big emotions. So I had a lot of big emotions. I had no idea how to work through them. And my parents weren't as emotional as me. And I don't think they knew either. I think it scared my dad, where he was just like, I don't want you to feel sad. Let's fix it. And he would do anything he could to fix it. My mother isn't, she's much more of a practical head. She has emotions obviously, but she doesn't express them in the same way as me. I think she just didn't know what to do. So I didn't know what to do either. And so when I had big emotions, I was like, I just felt really like, I have no idea how to cope. I don't know what to do with this. So let me reroute this charge of energy to food. That was a way that I dealt with it. I mean, I think as a child, I did other things first, and then it landed in food, and food is so easy. It's such an easy place for it to stay.
And so then emotional restriction could also be achieved through food restriction. Like we're talking about binging here in your example, binging to restrict your emotional experience, but also it's about using food in any way, I'm guessing then, to restrict your emotional experience. Mm-hmm. Is there a backlash to that in the way that we think of backlashes to other restrictions?
Part of a backlash is just not knowing then how to cope or how to deal with emotions and feeling like they're dangerous. Like I don't want emotions, and this is going to create a lot more fear around it and a lot more of creating coping mechanisms, whether that's food or other things in addition to food, to avoid going there. And also then it can then feed on itself in that we can binge more because emotions don't stop coming. So the more we have emotions, the more we might lean into that binge or restrict or both response. So it creates its secondary set of problems.
So is this just a pattern that people are in? Because we think of like restriction as creating a swing. When we mentally or physically restrict food, there's like a tension, like a pendulum swings up one way. And at some point, the control breaks and we swing the other way. If we're looking at emotional restriction, I suppose I'm curious about this idea of what tension that creates. I'm thinking to myself, if I am not allowing the full expression of whatever it is I'm feeling, and I'm not acknowledging my feelings, the paradox is the more I try to dampen them down, the bigger they get, the more chronic they feel, the more overwhelming that they feel. Is that like the binge? It's almost like we end up with a binge of feelings because we're trying to control them so much.
Yeah, if you think of it, it's like emotions are energy. And so where we have emotions and we're pushing them down, we're essentially collecting energy. We're pushing that further and further. And the more we're doing that, the more that energy doesn't die. It just changes shape and form, right? So we're essentially just collecting a whole lot of energy in our nervous systems all day long, perhaps, or over weeks, or over whatever amount of time where that's collecting enough. And then it needs to go somewhere. And there's a threshold. I think we all have different thresholds, and that's going to depend on our unique contexts. But eventually the dam breaks, and whatever energy is behind that usually, can get unleashed in the form of however that energy is going to manifest. So binges are a way of moving energy. And for me, the more I had pushed down, the more energy that was behind that, the more violent my binges felt.
I'm thinking as well, those big reactions to minor events as well can be that expulsion of energy.
Yes.
It's building up, building up, building up. Straw that breaks the camel's back maybe is not finding your keys and collapse in a heap over that because it's just the last bit.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that I don't think that just because you heal your relationship with food that you necessarily get a complete handle on that, because that still happens to me in just that, like where I can't find my keys. I'm still a work in progress as far as learning how my emotions, how to meet them. And I am really, as an adult, learning how do I handle my emotions. And so sometimes I do push them down. And when yesterday I found a cheese wrapper on the floor, like a cheese stick wrapper, and I was going to cry, and in the moment, it feels very real, but not going to cry. It had nothing to do with the food. It was just that my daughter left another cheese wrapper. It's like all of a sudden, like the dam broke, and I was like, oh my God. And knowing this isn't about the cheese wrapper. This is because like I've been having pent up things going on all week. But certainly food, especially where physical and mental restriction are also happening, this is the intersection of that. This is why I feel that they're different categories, because emotional restriction can exist on its own without the binge response, like I just described, where I'm no longer having a binge response. I'm not using that energy through food, but I still have some emotional restriction. But if I also had physical and mental restriction going on too, where that dam breaks, I would go to food because my physiology is pointing me there anyway, because of the physiology part and the psychological part of what restriction does. So it's going to make that such an easy slide.
So if somebody wasn't emotionally restricting at all, they're going through life with no emotional restriction, what would that look like?
Is there mental and physical restriction?
No, I'm sort of looking at the ideal. If we're saying that there's this cost to emotional restriction, what is the opposite of it? I think this is my question.
I think it's being able to have a much greater window of tolerance. So where you're able to sit in that zone of meeting life's stresses and demands with more, like it's a more productive way of meeting stress and being able to manage stress in a way where the body is like using it for motivation and to propel us into action where needed, but also not to become bogged down by cycles of perhaps, I don't know if I want to say anxiety and depression because that's a standalone and I'm not going to intersect them. But I find that when my threshold is smaller, I'm more prone to my episodes of anxiety and depression. Whereas when my emotions seem to be more well-regulated, I'm less prone to that. And I think as humans, like we want to have a really wide window of being able to have stress come in and out of our lives and be able to meet that without it overtaking us. And that emotional storage of energy is taking up a lot of the energy we need to deal with other things, to deal with day-to-day stress. So where that's clear, we have more room to be handling life's day-to-day stress energy rather.
And I would probably want to add something about acknowledgement and paying attention to feelings. Because I think when I have found that kind of buildup and there's some expulsion of energy, there's a big reaction that doesn't seem proportionate to the moment. Almost invariably, when I look back, I can see how I've been in a state of near constant distraction for the last couple of days. I haven't checked in with myself. I haven't taken a moment to be quiet and to just check in and go, like, how am I doing? To find that calmness in my own mind. I feel like tolerance comes from, or one of the skills that we can develop that will really help us increase our tolerance is being able to spend some time in our minds. Not necessarily in that heightened moment when the emotion is big, but otherwise, because I don't want to speak for everyone. I can speak for myself. I feel like I see it a lot. Like we're just bumbling through life, constantly consuming information or doing or being productive or beating ourselves up for not being productive. Or food becomes the thing to think about all the time.
Yeah, that's the distraction.
Mm.
I also think from the somatic point of view that also spending time, not necessarily in the mind, but in the present, in the world, like finding groundedness in your environment, because we feel through our senses. And so where we can look out and feel like the world is safe around us, or there's something that's calm, that we're not in danger, and we can use our senses to relate that back to our nervous systems. When I talk about right now as an adult, I'm learning to do this. I'm doing this through this practice of just touching base with the window in my office, like every few hours, because it's like the view outside just calms me down, and just touching base with that a little bit to remind, oh, I'm here. I'm not in this swirly whirly mind mess that sometimes I can create. I'm kind of like, oh yeah, okay. I ground myself out here. That helps communicate back to my system that we're okay. Like things are okay. There's not danger right now.
Checking in with me, I think, comes from checking in with what's the story. What are the stories I'm living in at the moment? Because I've got all these stories about my past. I've got stories about what I might hope for and fear in the future. And I've got stories in the present. And I had this moment on Wednesday morning. I'm just gonna, I don't know whether to talk about this on the podcast. I think people will just go, what? I had this moment where I was just sitting on the sofa and I was eating an orange. I was really trying to check in with myself, and I was being very conscious of my stories. And just for a brief second, it felt like past and future fell away. And I was just woman sitting eating orange. That was it. And it was only a glimpse. It was a glimpse for maybe 10 seconds or something like that. But it was such a moment of clarity, quiet.
That's zen.
It was a real moment of zen. And afterwards, when my mind started speeding up again, it made me think back to Byron Katie, where she said, all we're ever doing is standing up, sitting, or lying down. Everything else is a story. So I was still living a story. I was woman eating orange.
Yeah. Woman eating orange. I love those moments. I was just going to say that's the part of emotional restriction that can contribute to binge eating, but does not have to.
Yeah.
Whereas the other two tend to be more directly related. I think emotional restriction can compound the other two, but standalone without the other two is a different thing. Mm-hmm. That's why I see this as like a hierarchy of recovery. And that's how I teach about it in my groups, because it's that layer comes first, and then the emotions, which is why emotional eating became possible for me to address later. Rather than first, which is how I was taught to use to address my emotions first. And I still had all this other kinds of restriction going on underneath it. That's why it never was working.
There's another comment from one of our listeners, which I just want to check in whether this is what you mean by emotional restriction, or at least part of it. And they were asking about the emotional restriction thing. And they said, is it like restricting being true to yourself, speaking out, following your dreams, restricting your desires in other areas of life?
Yeah. So, yeah, I love this. This is like I love talking. This is my favorite part of all this. I think when initially we're talking about emotional restriction, it's more that acute day-to-day sort of compressing of energy. But overall, what is that leading to? Yes, it's like this sacrifice of authenticity and identity and knowing what we want and don't want. I think when we are chronically in a place of repression of emotions, because then how are we going to be in touch with who we are, or what makes us tick or what makes us upset. And all of that has to do with we need to be in touch with our emotions to be authentic. So yes, that is like sort of like the grander landscape of what emotional restriction would look like. And certainly part of the recovery process.
I think this one might be the nice sort of follow on. So I'm going to read another piece of feedback that we had about talking about honoring mental hunger is important in the beginning. I just started trying intuitive eating and I'm really struggling in that area and wondered if you could expand on it at all. I think, again, this was one you were talking about last week. So I'm just going to keep throwing the ball at you today.
Fine.
Well, the question was about wondering if you could expand on the concept of honoring mental hunger, because it feels so counterintuitive to what people believe about their physical hunger. If I'm not physically hungry, but my mind wants something and I'm prone to binging, how do I honor that? Like, how does that make sense in the moment? Because it feels counterintuitive.
Okay. I think this is one that happens in stages. So in the more initial phases of allowing food and not restricting it anymore, I think most of us are thinking of that in terms of the physical restriction and physically healing. Like maybe that means eating more food, more calories, more times of day, more frequently, or weight restoration. But there's an entire piece of recovering from restriction that's a psychological piece. So while you can honor hunger and eat enough and actually feel like you're getting the physiological feedback that I'm full, your psychology is not always in alignment with that, like toe to toe. Your psychology is like, hey, I still feel like at any moment we could go back on a diet or be deprived again, or we're going to start craving weight loss and all this is going to go away. I have years behind me of feeling like I wanted that second piece of something and couldn't have it. So I need some attention too. And that's happening separately than the physiology, which is why we can feel physically like I've had enough, but I still want more. It's a separate part of this process. I think these are two things, mental restriction and physical restriction, that are being addressed. They're separate though. So I think we get so afraid of, well, I'm full, but yet I want more. This is just more sign that I'm just obsessed with food or I'm addicted to it. And I can tell you personally, and also many clients I've had, that like that phase of wanting beyond fullness can be normal. Like for 3 to 6 months, I'd say, of the beginning of my process, I was regularly eating past fullness. I was not binging as much, but I was absolutely eating past fullness because my psychology was still like, are we good? Like, no, I don't, it wasn't ready to just give in to me so quickly. And so what happened was that over time, after those 6 months, for sure, after those 6 months, my psychology started to feel safe. I mean, that's the best way I could describe it. And I no longer was having the urges to continue eating so much when I was full. So I would get full, and there was a part of my brain that all of a sudden I was noticing was saying, okay, I'm done. And that was new. I hadn't been physically restricting in 6 months, but all of a sudden they took that a while for my psychology to say, okay, all right, I think we get fullness now. I am actually full. I don't want any more. And I was like, oh, okay. I didn't do anything for that to happen. That's just what happened that's how long it took. But it doesn't have to be something wrong. And I think when I began recovery earlier, years back, that part didn't make sense to me. And it scared me too much. And I was like, no, I can't trust this process because my brain will always want more food. And then I'll just be eating too much all the time. And in fact, where I actually did recover to the extent that I am now, it resolved. I do also think when I mentioned stages that there is a period of time later when the body is truly feeling safe and restriction hasn't been at play for a while, that there's, of course, another part of our psychology that feels safe in eating more and is afraid to say no to food, as we talked about in the last episode, because we're afraid to start to restrict. And there we can have a conversation about, okay, am I full enough to move away from this food and not feel deprived? And that might be more of like a dance that we can start engaging in. But in the beginning, And again, when I say beginning, that could be 6 months, it could be more than 6 months, but there's this period of time where that conversation isn't necessarily happening because your psychology is still on edge. And I usually work with clients and sort of in a good enough amount of time where I feel like, okay, I think that your body's feeling safe, but now we can have this conversation with we can talk about it more. It's about knowing where you are in that process, but there are stages of that happening, and we can do that too early.
Well, brains anticipate, right? That's what they do. They look for patterns. And if the pattern is always going in and out of restriction and binging, or planning to restrict, or expecting a diet around the corner, I think that that's going to impact your biology. And even, ghrelin, the hunger hormone, even thinking about being about to eat causes your ghrelin levels to rise. And I think that this can be a bit of a loop, right? If you're thinking about food all the time, your body is responding as if food is coming. So your biology is being shifted by your thoughts. So there's that swing between the two. I just think that we need a lot of reassurance, and that's going to come through eating, and it's going to come through the way that we speak to ourselves as well. Reassurance, which is why, and I've mentioned before, I don't think of it as yes or no. I think of it as now or not now when you're making a food choice.
Yeah. And I think that the goal there is, to me, it was like, I don't want to fight anymore. I don't want to fight with myself anymore. So where I was noticing that I was continuing to want food where I thought I quote unquote shouldn't be wanting it, it was like, just stay in a space of calm. That was my goal. And I noticed that my mind would want to be like, why do you want it? What if you want this forever? What if you keep wanting, do you really want this food? I mean, you're full. When you start engaging in that, then you're going into like that panic state. At least that would rev my anxiety. And then it took on a whole nother level of me like fighting food, which created more of an issue. So for me, it was like, okay, I'm entering into this process, like with acceptance on that. Like, I'm going to be mentally hungry, and I'm going to honor that mental hunger. And when I was able to stay peaceful with that, it didn't turn into a meta eating also, where I was then eating because I was getting activated about it. It's a lot of mindset in maintaining that. And I needed a ton of reassurance on the outside from other people. My path isn't everyone's, and there are other compounding variables that could interfere. Trauma, ADHD. I think that there's other scenarios in which I've seen that there needs to be more like massaging of this. But from just the straight up binge restrict history that I'd had, the extensive binge restrict history that I had, that is what I needed to do to make peace and to eventually come to a place of not having those binge urges anymore. We love connecting with our listeners, so we host regular community events on Zoom. We also have a private Facebook group for our Patreon supporters. Please visit our website, lifeafterdietspodcast.com, to find out more.
For more details about how to contact us or to work with Sarah or Steph individually, please check out the show notes. Now let's get back to the episode. We had another request from a listener who would like to hear more about restriction secondary to actual food, such as restricting times of day you allow yourself to eat, restricting when eating around certain people, such as family members, or only being allowed to eat with certain utensils, bowls, etc. I thought this was really interesting, this question. That whole idea. We're not talking about quantities here.
Yeah.
We're talking about situational restrictions.
Yeah. Well, this question reminded me of when we were saying that physical restrictions not just about how much food calorically. It's about not having food because of certain situations or certain considerations, like, well, I can't eat at this time because I'm fasting, or because Oprah said not to eat after 6 p.m. That one will never leave my head. I'm trying to see what were the other ones here, or in front of certain people. So that could be that could bleed into mental restriction a little bit, where I feel guilt for eating in front of these people because of judgment. On the other hand, well, is there a place for restricting in those ways that it wouldn't be counterproductive restriction? Or could that be innocuous?
Well, I think each person gets to test that out for themselves. I'm guessing the fact this is a question means that the person who's written it is struggling with some of these things. Thinking of eating at certain times of day. So there's medication that I take when I wake up in the morning, and I can't eat for an hour. I'm not supposed to eat for an hour after I take it. And that's always felt okay to me. I've also worked with people who've had a course of antibiotics, which they have to take with a meal 3 times a day. And that has caused just real challenges around planning food. And for me, it's something about taking away your sense of choice and freedom that was so triggering for me. I'd certainly had that when I was out with people or whatever, and I might not make the free choice that I would have made if I was not with another person, and then later come back and binge. There was a cost to doing that. And I would say if you're restricting when you're around certain people, that's probably physical restriction. You're around certain people and you can't eat certain foods. That's not just mental. You are actually not allowing yourself to eat those foods. So I would put that one in with physical restriction. And timing can be a bit like physical restriction as well. You might have a body that wants to eat within half an hour of waking up. Your body is calling you for food, and by delaying that, you're ending up getting a backlash later. So physical restriction, a little bit like we talked about last week, restricting certain types of foods, but not necessarily quantities. I think it comes with that, but there's a load of mental restriction in as well. It's both. Normally it's both, right? If there's physical restriction, there's mental restriction too.
Yeah, they're pretty hand in hand, usually, not always. But yeah, I think where you're asking about, or this question asks about those types of restriction, they would factor into a binge response the way any other physical restriction or mental restriction would. The body is still perceiving. Now, I think the caveats are like what you're mentioning, where there's a medication, like there's a reason for that. Or I've had to fast for blood work and I couldn't get an appointment until 11. And I had to fast to get that blood work done all morning. Where is it restriction? Yes. Is it coming from a place of peace for me? Yes, because I understood why. It made a perfect sense to me. It was not a means of punishing myself. It was, I needed to get blood work done. To me, my psychology hears that and it's like, okay, that's fair. But if I had just woken up and been like, I ate too much yesterday, I'm not eating till noon, my brain would have been like, no, that's you're restricting me. I'm going to start getting cranky. So it's the same scenario. It's very much about looking at where it's coming from. What is the driver of it? So where we're not eating in front of certain people, to me, most of the time, I would say that sounds like the brain might get icky about that. There's some shame there. Versus, I mean, there might be people who, when we eat in front of them, we know that there might be a reaction. Like I've known people who've had family members who would say things that were really damaging. And so there might be a protective response of, I don't want to eat in front of this person because it could end up really hurting me. And I don't, it's protective in that way. That's fuzzy, that area, because there still is shame potentially involved in that. But there's also self-protection. And when I think about it, it's like coming to what is inside of you, inside of why you're doing something and how much shame is attached to it, and how, what is the emotion behind it? Because your body, I think, is receptive to that and understands like where we're doing something to punish or to hide or to sacrifice some part of ourselves, versus to say, this makes sense to me and I'm not out to deprive myself. I just need to stay safe here. And I think that matters.
Another one that's popped into my head, and it comes from my brother who claims it to be scientific information. And he said that to get over jet lag, it's all about getting back on your meal times. For him, if he was leaving the US, for example, with the way the time works, we jump ahead here, he would miss a meal and then make sure that when he landed, he was eating at sort of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And he swears by that as a way to recover from jet lag. Well, no, he doesn't have a history of disordered eating. He has a pretty cool relationship with food as well. But it's like a type of restriction that makes sense to him.
But again, the reason is and it's shame-free. It's like there's something about that that's very, it's not about punishment. It's about like, I can understand that. Psychologically, I could get behind that idea. Absolutely. But if you're coming from a place of disordered eating and you're like, oh, good, I'm going to get away with skipping a meal, your brain hears that too and is like, oh, no, you're not. Or potentially not. So it matters what's going on in the background of that.
Yeah. Or it feels like an extra meal because there's extra hours.
Yeah, either way.
Yeah, so it feels like you've had too many meals when you're traveling because all the times are messed up. But yeah. What about the bit where she asks about using certain utensils and
Mm.
bowls.
I never did that, so I didn't want to rush to speak on it in case you had more to say. But to me, this is that safety. It sounds like a safe food type of thing where, there's a, um, what is it? The ritual of that. I don't know that I've dealt with that one directly.
I think I would probably want to answer this question with a question. I would be thinking, I'm going to go back to stories. What's the story around using that utensil and that bowl? What does your mind tell you is going to happen if you used a different one? Because when you say, okay, I'll use a different one, what's the response to that? If it's fear, and I'm guessing, I don't know if this is the case for this person, that the safety might be in like, I know the quantity that's in this bowl.
Mm.
So you might not be measuring, I don't know if you're having porridge or something, but I know this bowl so well that I know that
Yeah.
up to that level is that amount of porridge. And in that case, that for me would be coming under physical and
Yes.
mental restriction, right?
Yeah, I think, yes. It's the same as like measuring food or a portion capping or something,
Yeah.
because it's essentially the same idea.
But on the other side, it could be tied in with some kind of neurodiversity
Yes.
experience. And if it's a case of the familiarity and it's not a problem for you, and I suppose no one can really answer the question, is this problematic? Is this fueling or making recovery harder by sticking to this? It might be something that you need for now, depending on where you are in your recovery. It might not be something that you're ready to challenge, but I would be curious around the story behind it. What happens if you think about moving away from this? Because that will reveal your reasons for doing this.
Yeah, exactly. Perfectly said.
Thank you.
We have time for one more, yes?
We didn't really touch on last week around restrictions for health, and this is a big one.
Yes.
Before we talk about this,
Yes. Okay.
disclaimer, Steph and I, we're not medical professionals, we're not nutritionists. Please do not take any of what we say as advice for what you should do, turning it into a should. We might just share our thoughts and very much our personal opinions about this. Do you think I've covered us?
Yeah, I like that. I want to write that down.
Okay. It sounded a bit stern. I didn't mean to sound stern with everybody. Just don't want to get sued. Okay. So the first, I'm going to read out the two that have been written, and we'll try and put them together because of time. So one person writes, I have Hashimoto's and it's advised to cut out gluten, sugar, and dairy. This has really shaken me up and goes against what I've learned about binge eating recovery. Do you think it's possible to recover with these food restrictions? And then someone else has just asked a broader question. I wonder if you have any insights for those of us restricted for genuine health reasons in what we can eat. First thing I want to say is, doesn't it seem to be the case with almost every medical condition, if there's any dietary changes to be made, it's gluten, sugar, and dairy.
Yes.
And there's all these ideas around these foods as being the most problematic foods for people. How I might think of this is that with certain medical conditions, let's say gluten makes it 20% better if you give up gluten, because you're not going to get rid of Hashimoto's by cutting these things out. Let's say gluten makes it 20% better. Giving up sugar doesn't really have an impact, and giving up dairy makes it 2% better. This idea that the combination of these three things are all having the same impact, I think is problematic, because it's a lot to ask for somebody of disordered eating, and you might be giving up one of these three things that actually your body is okay with. There might be other bodies that are more impacted by that. So what is it you're hoping to gain by cutting these things out and moving out of that black and white thinking? And if this is something you really feel like you need to test out for your health, testing that one at a time. Do one. What's the response to that? Can you get bloods done to show if that's actually making a difference? How do you feel in yourself about that? As opposed to this blanket, these three foods groups can be problematic for some people with certain conditions, and I don't deny that that's possibly the case. But to assume then that you have to just give up all three because one of them might be impacting you, I think may not be worth it if you're struggling with disordered eating, if it's going to make food much harder for you. That's my initial response to these kinds of questions. Again, personal opinion, please don't take it as advice.
I wholeheartedly agree. And as someone who I was instructed to stop gluten, dairy, soy, yada, 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 all these things. And I was like, okay, good. That goes along with my desire to lose weight anyway. And so I did, and none of them had an impact actually on to any measurable effect. I didn't notice it symptom wise, and it never showed up in blood work, but I just took it as blanket advice. So one of the things I always want to say is, are you taking this advice without doing critical thinking about it? Are you just sort of taking it and running with it because someone said so? And it's very trendy to take away lots of these kinds of foods right now. Does it make sense for you? I have clients who are like, I don't notice a darn difference when I take gluten out. And I have others who are like, I'm not celiac, but I get incredible pain in my stomach every time. And it's the short of it is that I think you can honor true sensitivities or allergies
Tolerance.
without compromising recovery. But again, it comes back to this idea of why you're doing it. So if you feel a difference or you see a change in your health status through blood work or whatever symptoms because of a certain food group that might be interacting with that, that's going to be inherently motivating to you to feel like, okay, this makes sense to me, versus someone told me to do this, so I'm just taking all these things out and it doesn't even feel true for me. I don't even know that this is affecting me. It just might be another sneaky way of eliminating food or listening to somebody else's wisdom about me, which is slippery. And so, yes, I think that we can honor restrictions and still maintain recovery. But I think knowing why we're having those restrictions and are they true for us is everything.
But if there's something that you absolutely believe and your experience is that this is problematic for you to have it, or it's harmful and you're looking at, or you have cut something out, the way I look at it is to keep looking at that as a choice that you're making over and over again. Because the all or nothing thinking can freak out a bit when you're like, oh, okay, I can never have this food again, or I can never have that food again. And I also really want to speak to people who've been told and really believe that there are foods that they shouldn't be eating, but they still are. That guilt and the shame that people go to where it's like, I can't even do this for my health. Like, it's medically advised not to have this.
Yeah.
I have these symptoms, and yet I'm still eating these foods. Well, I just urge a bit of self-compassion, because this is what compulsive eating does. It is this big. It is your survival drive really kicking in and taking you forward, because you might have a mind that, or a body and a brain that's gone through restriction, that's going to have a really strong reaction to perceiving that something's not available. It's going to trigger a sense of food scarcity, I think, which is where the reassurance comes in. And the way I see it is regularly making this choice and saying, okay, let me just choose this for today, even doing it like on a daily basis. You don't know what you're going to do in 6 months, a year's time, 2 years' time, whether you're ever going to have this food again. I think the brain can freak out just with that belief that this food is never going to be available again.
Yeah. To that point, I just want to tell like a story of how this worked for me. So when I was given the diagnosis of Lyme disease and I was told to take out, I'm going to use gluten as the example. So I took it out and I couldn't stop eating. I would binge on it. I would leave it out for a bit and then I would binge. And I can't imagine that was good for my health, right? If I just kept the gluten in to begin with. But I went through that. After recovery, so not even that long ago, I said, I'm going to try, I started to get some joint pain. And I said, I'm going to try taking gluten out now that my relationship with food is healed and see if that's any different. I was able to take gluten out without binging, but ultimately it didn't do anything. It still didn't have any effect. So it's back in. But I just want to say, like, I couldn't do it for my health before that relationship with food was healed, but I could later. I was actually able to do that because I trusted. There was so much trust about why I was doing it. It wasn't a sneaky way of manipulating food and having control over food. So, and I wasn't restricting anymore. So that context made a huge difference. So yes, I think that there's a possibility, but I think sometimes the foundation of the relationship with food coming first may be relevant.
I'm very conscious that we received a lot more questions and requests for us to address this in different ways. We might look at trying to weave them into future episodes. So if you messaged us and we didn't get round to discussing your topic, we haven't forgotten you, and we will try to weave it into some of our future episodes.
Yes. Or if you're a patron, we can also address questions in the Patreon group.
Yeah. And if you want to become a patron. patreon.com/life after diets.